writing was Buddy Holly. That would be the day. Is that true?
Yeah, most of the stars then were kind of good-looking guys.
Everly Brothers.
Yeah.
You won't believe the shocking truth Paul McCartney just revealed about Buddy Holly. For years, rumors have swirled about the legendary Beatles member's deep connection to the iconic rock and roll star. But McCartney has remained tight-lipped until now. In a groundbreaking interview, McCartney has finally confirmed what fans have been speculating for decades. Buddy Holly's influence on the Beatles was far more profound than anyone could have imagined. But here's the twist. You might be surprised to learn just how deep that connection really goes. Was McCartney secretly obsessed with Holly's genius from the very beginning? Did Buddy Holly's sound shape not just their early hits, but the very core of the Beatles' music? The early influence of Buddy Holly on McCartney. When Paul McCartney first picked up a guitar in the early 1960s, he had no idea that the rock and roll legend Buddy Holly would have such a profound impact on his musical direction. At the time, the Beatles were just another band trying to make their mark in the rapidly growing world of rock and roll. But in the midst of it all, one artist stood out to McCartney: Buddy Holly. McCartney, like so many young musicians of his time, was inspired by Holly's raw energy, his ability to craft unforgettable melodies, and, most importantly, his fearless approach to songwriting. For McCartney, Holly wasn't just another idol, he was a game changer. In interviews over the years, McCartney has been candid about how Holly's music shaped the way he and John Lennon approached their songwriting. McCartney recalls the moment when he first heard "That'll Be the Day," and it was like a light bulb went off. Holly's ability to blend catchy rock and roll riffs with heartfelt lyrics left an indelible mark on McCartney's own songwriting style. McCartney's admiration for Holly went beyond just his music. It was about Holly's attitude, his willingness to push the boundaries of the genre. Holly was a rock star who wrote his own songs, played his own instruments, and controlled his own sound. This independence would become a hallmark of the Beatles as they evolved into one of the most innovative musical forces in history. Buddy Holly's influence was immediately evident in the early Beatles' sound. As a band that was still finding their footing, the Beatles experimented with covers of popular rock songs, and Buddy Holly was one of their primary inspirations. In fact, their early repertoire was full of Holly covers, including "Words of Love," which became one of the highlights of their Beatles for Sale album. McCartney's fondness for Holly's songs went beyond just covering them. He saw Holly as a blueprint for what he wanted to create. It wasn't just about playing fast songs with catchy riffs. It was about infusing their music with a sense of personal expression, vulnerability, and creativity. Holly's influence gave McCartney and Lennon the confidence to break from the conventions of the time and pursue a more authentic and unique sound. What makes this even more fascinating is how McCartney's admiration for Holly influenced the way he viewed songwriting in the early years of the Beatles. Holly was a pioneer in how he approached storytelling in his songs. He didn't just sing about love, he wrote about heartbreak, longing, and life's struggles. McCartney, particularly in the early Beatles years, began to experiment with more introspective and personal lyrics, something that would later become one of the Beatles' trademarks. But it wasn't just the songwriting that was influenced by Buddy Holly. It was also Holly's innovative studio techniques that would shape the way the Beatles recorded their music. Buddy Holly was one of the first musicians to experiment with overdubbing, a technique that would later become synonymous with the Beatles' groundbreaking studio work. McCartney, who was always keen on pushing the boundaries of music production, saw how Holly used the studio to create new sounds and textures. It's no coincidence that as the Beatles started to record their own albums, they too began to experiment with multi-tracking, creating layers of sound that had never been heard before in rock music. Holly's experimentation in the studio planted the seeds for what would become the Beatles' revolutionary approach to recording music. In fact, the early Beatles albums are full of elements that can be traced back to Holly's influence. Whether it was the close harmonies in songs like Please Please Me or the use of simple but effective guitar riffs, the Beatles were channeling the raw energy of Holly's music while adding their own unique twist. But it wasn't just the music itself that was inspired by Holly. It was also the attitude toward performing. Holly, with his nerdy glasses and boy-next-door look, defied the typical rock star image of the time. He was unpretentious and genuine in his performances, something McCartney admired deeply. As the Beatles began to find their identity, they too embraced this authenticity. Becoming more than just a band, they became a cultural movement that changed the world. Paul McCartney's connection to Buddy Holly didn't end with the early days of the Beatles. Over the years, McCartney has consistently referred to Holly as one of his primary musical influences. In a 2007 interview, McCartney once again paid tribute to Holly, saying, "He was one of the first rock and rollers to have an impact on me. He showed me that you could write your own songs and make a career out of it." This acknowledgement is more than just a passing comment. It's a reminder of the profound impact Buddy Holly had on the young McCartney and how that influence would shape the future of rock music. For McCartney, Buddy Holly wasn't just a rock and roll star, he was a mentor and a role model. Holly's ability to craft timeless songs that resonated with audiences around the world was a skill that McCartney aspired to emulate. What's even more fascinating is how this influence transcended McCartney's early career. Even in his solo work after the Beatles, McCartney continued to channel the energy and creativity he had learned from Buddy Holly. Songs like Maybe I'm Amazed and Band on the Run contain echoes of Holly's spirit, bold, experimental, and deeply personal. By acknowledging Buddy Holly as a foundational influence on his music, McCartney not only honors the memory of one of rock's greatest pioneers, but also demonstrates how deeply intertwined their creative paths really were. McCartney's confirmation of this long-standing influence sheds light on the pivotal role Buddy Holly played in shaping not only the Beatles' early sound, but also McCartney's overall approach to music. As McCartney continues to perform and record new music, there's no doubt that Buddy Holly's influence remains an integral part of his musical identity. Now that McCartney has confirmed how deeply Buddy Holly influenced the Beatles' sound, what other hidden gems from McCartney's early influences have shaped the iconic Beatles music we know today? Acquiring Buddy Holly's song catalog. In 1971, a decade after the Beatles had already reshaped the musical landscape, Paul McCartney made a bold move that further cemented his respect and admiration for Buddy Holly. It wasn't just about recording his songs or covering them in concert. It was about securing the legacy of Holly's music for future generations. McCartney, through his company MPL Communications, purchased the publishing rights to Buddy Holly's song catalog, which included timeless classics like That'll Be the Day, Peggy Sue, and True Love Ways. At the time, McCartney's decision to buy the rights wasn't just a business venture. It was a personal tribute to the musician who had inspired him so profoundly. Holly's influence on McCartney had been evident since the very early days of the Beatles, and acquiring Holly's catalog was a way to ensure that his music would continue to resonate with audiences long after his death. Holly, who tragically died at the young age of 22 in a plane crash, left behind a legacy that, in McCartney's eyes, had not been fully appreciated in the years following his passing. McCartney believed that Holly's contribution to rock and roll deserved to be preserved, and he wanted to make sure that the power of Holly's songs would continue to inspire future generations. This purchase was significant not only for the musical world, but also for McCartney personally. He had always been deeply connected to music that spoke to him on a fundamental level, and Holly's songs were no exception. McCartney often described how, as a young man, he would listen to Holly's music and feel an immediate connection to the raw emotion and simple beauty of the lyrics. Songs like That'll Be the Day weren't just catchy. They were heartfelt expressions of love, loss, and longing. These were the kinds of songs McCartney aspired to write, and owning them felt like a way of bringing Holly's genius into his own life in a more intimate way. But the acquisition of Buddy Holly's catalog wasn't just a tribute to McCartney's musical hero. It was also a strategic business decision. At the time, music publishing was an undervalued asset in the industry, and the rights to popular songs could be purchased for relatively low prices. McCartney's savvy decision to buy Holly's catalog for a fraction of its potential worth proved to be a masterstroke. Over the years, Buddy Holly's music would continue to generate significant revenue, and McCartney's purchase of the catalog would pay dividends, both financially and emotionally. The deal itself, which involved the purchase of Holly's songs from the estate of Norman Petty, Holly's producer and manager, was groundbreaking in its own right. Petty had been one of the key figures in Holly's early career, but his business dealings with Holly's music had been controversial after the musician's death. Petty, along with Holly's widow, Maria Elena Holly, had controlled the rights to his music for many years. But by the early 1970s, there was growing concern among Holly's fans and family that his music was not receiving the respect it deserved. McCartney's decision to purchase the catalog from Petty and his business partners helped ensure that Buddy Holly's music would be treated with the reverence it deserved. For McCartney, the acquisition of Holly's catalog was a deeply personal gesture. It was a way for him to preserve the songs that had shaped his musical identity, but it was also a way for him to honor the memory of a musician who had passed away far too young. Holly's career, though short, had been incredibly influential, and McCartney believed that his music needed to be preserved not just for commercial reasons, but for cultural reasons. At the time, the music industry was beginning to see a rise in nostalgia for the 1950s, and Holly's music was seen as the perfect embodiment of that era. By acquiring the rights, McCartney ensured that Holly's legacy would continue to live on in the public consciousness. The purchase of Holly's catalog was also symbolic of McCartney's evolving role as a steward of rock and roll history. As the Beatles disbanded and McCartney moved into his solo career, he began to see himself not just as an artist, but as a protector of the musical legacy of previous generations. In the years that followed, McCartney would go on to acquire the rights to other influential artists' catalogs, including those of artists like the Everly Brothers and the Beach Boys. But it was his acquisition of Buddy Holly's catalog that would always be the most personal and meaningful. In many ways, McCartney's decision to buy Buddy Holly's catalog reflected the respect and admiration he had for the musician, not just as an artist, but as a pioneer of rock and roll. Holly's ability to fuse pop melodies with the emerging sounds of rock and roll created a new template for future artists. And McCartney, who had himself become a pioneer of sorts with the Beatles, saw Holly as an essential figure in the history of popular music. McCartney also recognized that Holly's songs, which had been covered by countless artists over the years, had become part of the DNA of rock music. To own those songs was to own a piece of rock and roll history, and McCartney saw this acquisition as his way of keeping that history alive. Years later, McCartney would reflect on how purchasing Holly's catalog was one of the most fulfilling decisions he had ever made. It wasn't just about making money or boosting his own status. It was about keeping the spirit of Buddy Holly's music alive for future generations. Holly's songs, McCartney would say, were timeless, and by acquiring the rights to them, he ensured that they would continue to be heard, appreciated, and respected for decades to come. Even after all these years, McCartney's connection to Buddy Holly remains as strong as ever. In interviews and performances, McCartney has continued to express his deep admiration for the rock and roll legend. Holly's influence can still be heard in McCartney's music, whether it's in the way he structures his songs or the way he uses melodies to evoke emotion. The purchase of Buddy Holly's song catalog was more than just a business decision. It was a tribute to a musical hero who had shaped the course of McCartney's career in ways that would last a lifetime. But why did McCartney feel it was so important to preserve Buddy Holly's legacy, even years after the Beatles had made their mark on history? Was it about more than just admiration for a rock legend? Paying tribute in Lubbock. In 2014, Paul McCartney took his admiration for Buddy Holly to an entirely new level when he made the bold decision to perform in Lubbock, Texas, Holly's hometown. While McCartney had paid tribute to Holly in interviews and through his music, this concert marked a powerful and symbolic gesture, signaling just how much Holly had influenced McCartney's life and career. For McCartney, performing in Lubbock was more than just a concert. It was a deeply personal tribute to the man who had unknowingly guided the course of his musical journey. It was his way of honoring Holly's legacy and acknowledging the profound impact the late rocker had on shaping McCartney's sound. Lubbock, Texas, was the place where Buddy Holly's musical journey began, and the city was forever marked by the loss of the young rock and roll icon who had tragically passed away at the age of 22 in a plane crash. Holly had become a cultural legend in Lubbock, and while McCartney had performed in countless cities around the world, performing in Lubbock carried special significance. It wasn't just a concert, it was a pilgrimage to the roots of rock and roll, a celebration of Holly's music, and a way for McCartney to show his deep respect for the man who had helped shape his musical world. The concert, held at the United Supermarkets Arena, was a once-in-a-lifetime event for both McCartney and the people of Lubbock. McCartney, known for his generosity toward fans, acknowledged the special nature of the event, taking time to speak about Holly's influence on his music before performing a series of Beatles hits and some of his own solo songs. For many in the audience, this performance was a moment of catharsis, a way to connect with the past while celebrating the present. McCartney's performance in Lubbock wasn't just about showcasing his own achievements. It was about paying tribute to the foundation of rock and roll that Buddy Holly had helped lay. Before the show, McCartney spoke candidly about his first encounter with Buddy Holly's music, recalling how he had heard Holly's songs on the radio as a young boy and been immediately captivated by the simple beauty and energy in the music. Buddy Holly was one of the first people I really, truly admired, McCartney said. He showed us all that you didn't have to be like the traditional crooners of the time. You could be yourself, you could rock, you could roll, and it was okay. This acknowledgement not only demonstrated McCartney's continued admiration for Holly, but it also underlined how deeply Holly's authenticity and individuality had resonated with McCartney, who would later become known for his own groundbreaking music that defied conventional expectations. The connection between McCartney and Holly went beyond admiration for the music. Holly's authenticity and commitment to his craft were qualities that McCartney admired and sought to emulate throughout his career. Holly was often ahead of his time in terms of both his musical style and his personal image. He broke away from the more polished and formulaic style of the earlier rock and roll stars. McCartney, in turn, embraced the same philosophy of individuality, making it one of the key ingredients in the Beatles' success. McCartney's tribute in Lubbock was his way of acknowledging that, without Buddy Holly's groundbreaking approach to music, the world might not have had the Beatles as we know them. The significance of McCartney performing in Lubbock went beyond just paying tribute to Holly. It was a symbol of the deep personal connection McCartney felt toward Holly and his music. For McCartney, performing in Holly's hometown was an emotional and spiritual experience. It was an opportunity to stand in the place where Holly's musical legacy had begun and to share in the joy of his music with a community that had never stopped celebrating his life. McCartney's performance became not just a concert, but a collective celebration of the man who had laid the groundwork for rock music as we know it today. After the performance, McCartney reflected on the importance of the event, saying, "Lubbock is the place where Buddy Holly came from. And when I stepped on that stage, I felt like I was standing on the shoulders of a giant." McCartney's words resonated with the crowd as they understood the significance of the moment. For McCartney, playing in Lubbock was a way of coming full circle. From a young boy in Liverpool, inspired by Holly's music, to a musical legend in his own right, performing on the very stage where Holly had once lived and worked. In his interviews surrounding the performance, McCartney spoke about how Buddy Holly's music had stayed with him throughout his life. Even as McCartney became a household name and carved out his own space in the annals of rock history, Holly's influence never left him. McCartney was not just paying tribute to a musical icon, he was acknowledging the profound effect Holly had on his own journey, a journey that would go on to inspire generations of musicians, much like Holly's had. The Lubbock performance wasn't just McCartney's way of showing respect for a fallen hero, it was his way of showing the world that the legacy of Buddy Holly was alive and well, continuing to shape the world of music. But was McCartney's tribute in Lubbock the only way he has honored Buddy Holly's legacy over the years? What other surprising ways has McCartney kept Holly's spirit alive in his music? A legacy of innovation. In 2024, during a special Radio 2 documentary, Paul McCartney took the opportunity to reflect deeply on Buddy Holly's lasting influence on his music and the Beatles' groundbreaking sound. McCartney described Holly as an all-inclusive one-man band, an artist whose versatility and innovative approach to music inspired McCartney in ways that extended beyond just the melodies. McCartney's admiration for Holly went far beyond simply enjoying his music. It was about the way Holly transformed the role of the artist in popular culture. Holly was one of the first rock musicians to write his own songs, record them in innovative ways, and push the boundaries of what was possible with the available technology. McCartney saw in Holly a pioneer, a musical innovator who didn't just create timeless songs, but reshaped the very landscape of rock and roll. In the documentary, McCartney acknowledged that Holly's ability to blend melody, harmony, and meaningful lyrics was something he and John Lennon both admired intensely. But beyond that, McCartney revealed a deeper layer of Holly's influence, the way he used the studio as a musical instrument. Holly was one of the early pioneers of overdubbing, a technique that would eventually become synonymous with the Beatles' groundbreaking work in the studio. Holly's use of multiple tracks and layering of sounds gave his records an innovative texture that had never been heard before. McCartney credited this approach as a key inspiration behind the Beatles' own use of the studio as a creative tool. Holly's boldness in experimenting with sound had a direct influence on the Beatles' later works, including Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and Revolver, where they pushed the boundaries of studio techniques and musical structure. McCartney emphasized in the interview that Holly's influence wasn't just in his musical style, but also in the way he approached his career and his public persona. Holly broke the mold of the typical rock star of his time. While many of his contemporaries relied on flashy performances and traditional showmanship, Holly's appeal lay in his relatability. He wasn't just an entertainer, he was an artist who expressed his personal experiences and emotions through his music, making a connection with his audience that felt real and sincere. This authenticity was something that McCartney and the other members of the Beatles recognized and admired. As the Beatles rose to fame, they realized that their success wasn't just based on their musical ability. It was because they had tapped into something raw and genuine in their music, much like Holly had done before them. What McCartney also pointed out, with a sense of reverence, was that Buddy Holly was ahead of his time, experimenting with sounds and structures that would later become central to the way rock and roll evolved. Holly didn't just follow trends, he set them. His songs were innovative for their time, blending rockabilly, pop, and R&B in ways that were fresh and exciting. As McCartney reflected on this, he revealed just how much of an influence Holly's fearless approach to music had on him. It was a reminder that, like Holly, McCartney was also someone who wasn't afraid to push boundaries. McCartney's work with the Beatles would continue to challenge the status quo of popular music, much like Holly had done in the 1950s. In the interview, McCartney also reflected on how, at the time of his early music career, rock and roll was still a new and evolving genre. There were few musical heroes who had been able to combine such a powerful mix of creativity, commercial success, and influence as Holly had. Buddy Holly was one of those guys who changed the game for all of us, McCartney said. He was an all-around musician. He didn't just sing the songs, he wrote them, produced them, and played them. He was his own boss in the studio. McCartney's admiration for Holly was not only rooted in the music itself, but also in the way Holly took control of his art, an approach McCartney would adopt later in his own career as he moved into his solo work and beyond. For McCartney, it was also the emotional resonance of Holly's songs that made them so important. While Holly's music was often upbeat and fast-paced, it carried a depth that made it relatable to people from all walks of life. McCartney described how songs like True Love Ways carried a quiet beauty, with lyrics that touched on love and loss, topics that McCartney himself would explore in later years. He described how, for him, these songs weren't just part of the pop culture of the time, they were songs that connected to something deeply human. Holly's ability to convey complex emotions with simple words was a trait that McCartney admired, and one he would continue to emulate throughout his career. Holly's influence is especially evident in the way McCartney has approached the songwriting process throughout his career. While Lennon and McCartney's partnership became legendary for producing some of the greatest songs in rock and roll history, McCartney's admiration for Holly's work pushed him to grow as a composer. Holly's ability to write catchy hooks that could be both simple and profound was a quality McCartney continued to incorporate into his own writing. Holly's music wasn't just about flashy guitar riffs or loud performances, it was about the power of melody and lyricism, a lesson McCartney would take with him as he wrote hits for the Beatles and in his solo career. But perhaps one of the most significant ways in which McCartney has carried on Buddy Holly's legacy is through his ongoing celebration of Holly's music. From his early Beatles covers of Holly's songs to his acquisition of Holly's song catalog in 1971, McCartney has always been deeply connected to Holly's body of work. His efforts to preserve Holly's music for future generations not only underscore his admiration for the artist, but also reflect McCartney's commitment to keeping rock and roll history alive. McCartney's acquisition of Holly's song catalog was a major moment in preserving the legacy of one of rock's founding figures, ensuring that future generations would continue to hear the songs that helped shape the world of popular music. This ongoing relationship between McCartney and Buddy Holly's music is not just a story of admiration. It's a story of a true musical legacy, one that transcends time and continues to inspire. In the same way that Holly's music inspired McCartney in the 1960s, McCartney has used his own music to carry that torch forward, ensuring that Buddy Holly's contributions to rock and roll remain celebrated, understood, and respected by each new generation of fans and musicians. But how far did Buddy Holly's influence truly extend beyond McCartney's music? Could his impact on rock and roll have been even greater if he hadn't tragically died so young? The continuing legacy of Buddy Holly through McCartney's work. Buddy Holly's influence on Paul McCartney didn't end in the 1960s. Holly's legacy continues to resonate in McCartney's music, and it's clear in the echoes of Holly's songwriting found in McCartney's own hits. Holly's unique blend of catchy melodies and emotional depth laid the groundwork for McCartney to create music that's both unforgettable and deeply meaningful. Throughout his solo career, McCartney has continued to channel Buddy Holly's spirit, consciously or unconsciously. Songs like Maybe I'm Amazed and Live and Let Die carry the same melodic inventiveness Holly brought to his track. McCartney, like Holly, has always pushed the boundaries, experimenting in the studio and live performances. This fearlessness remains a cornerstone of McCartney's success, just as it was for Holly when he pioneered techniques like overdubbing in the 1950s. Holly's influence also shines through in McCartney's performing style. Like Holly, McCartney has always embraced an authentic, unpretentious approach to music. Whether performing with the Beatles or as a solo artist, McCartney has focused on the music rather than the spectacle, reflecting the humility Holly brought to his own shows. McCartney's energetic and joyful performances are a direct tribute to Holly's spirit. Even in his more reflective ballads like Yesterday and Blackbird, McCartney channels Holly's ability to create simple yet profound music. Holly's talent for evoking strong emotions with sparse arrangements inspired McCartney to do the same, creating songs that are both personal and universally relatable. McCartney has consistently celebrated Holly's legacy, including participating in a special tribute concert for Holly in 2021, further solidifying the bond between the two musicians. For McCartney, it's not just about honoring a fellow artist. It's about recognizing the profound impact Holly's music had on his own artistic evolution. As McCartney continues to tour and record, Holly's influence remains a central part of his creative process, ensuring that Holly's music lives on for generations to come. Paul McCartney's ongoing tribute to Buddy Holly shows just how deep the rock and roll pioneer's influence runs in McCartney's music. From early covers to preserving Holly's catalog, McCartney has ensured that Holly's legacy continues to inspire generations. What do you think? How did Buddy Holly shape McCartney's music? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from music history.